and welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Welcome back to TTS Talking Early Years with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest, Steph Ainsworth. And in this episode, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion around what leaders can do within organisations to help to engender this culture of resilience that we've already identified in the previous episodes is really important if we want it to be successful.
It kind of depends on the setting in some ways. What are the things that leaders can do to make the biggest difference to teachers? So the first thing I would say about this is it's good to sort of talk to people in your setting and figure out what is most important to them. And I know a lot of schools now do have kind of wellbeing surveys, etc., which, if they're anonymous, can be really helpful in terms of helping people to speak freely and talk about the things that are most important to them and what kind of leadership practices might be tweaked in a helpful way. When we have done that process with schools and we've asked teachers at schools what are their ideas about any little tweaks that could be made, some of the things that come up are around workload. So understandably, that comes up a lot, and the teachers that we speak to tend to say, you know, we do understand why our workload is high. We know that the leaders in our school are doing their best. We know a lot of this is out of their control, etc. However, they really value it when school leaders are able to make tweaks to just reduce things as much as possible, because those little changes add up. So I think it can work really well for settings to have conversations together to try and work on solutions collaboratively. And that helps people get their voices heard, but also it just means there's more ideas to sort of choose from in terms of this tricky issue. So one of the things that comes up a lot with workload is this idea of collecting evidence. And I know that's something that's, well, it's relevant throughout all the age phases, isn't it? But in early years, I remember many nights of the back to sticky labels. I don't know if anyone's got memories of that. Sorting them out into piles, and even have my mum sorting them into piles for me, drowning sticky labels. And I think, you know, things have moved on a lot, and I know technology's kind of changed things, people using iPads, etc. But teachers still talk about finding it frustrating when they feel they're collecting evidence for evidence's sake rather than focused on the learning. And I think there has been a bit of a policy shift as well to try and help teachers to feel that they don't need to do as much of that. But it's still tricky, isn't it? Because ultimately you do still feel like you need to prove, because we've got a high accountability system, you've got to prove that you know what you're doing.
Yeah, and I often hear it that people will say, like, I know it says in the early years foundation stage guidance that you don't need to collect this evidence, but it's our school policy that we have to have a this book and a that book, or you need to show this, you need to show that. So therefore, even though our guidance says no, you don't, the school policy says yes, you do. And again, it's about having all the opportunity to have those conversations. And I get where it comes from. We were in a culture of being, you know, looked at by organizations or bodies like Ofsted, and there was a huge fear around what can happen as a result of an Ofsted judgment. And so I think everybody tends to over-egg the pudding, and especially if you are a school leader and you're not really au fait with early years, or, you know, if you're a nursery leader and you need to be able to quantify attainment, and the only way you can quantify attainment is through concrete evidence, rather than somebody saying, oh, the attainment's contained in the challenge of my continuous provision, which they might be able to chat to you about, you might not be able to do that, then they can see why you get that kind of more formal way of recording pushed into what's really an inappropriate stage of development for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does take quite a lot of bravery to sort of stand up against it as a head or a phase lead or whatever. It's very difficult. So as we keep saying in these episodes, we you know, I definitely don't want it to sound like, oh, it's suggesting any of these things are easy to do. And it's got to be, you know, depending on what position your school's in as well, of course. If you're your school's currently it requires improvement. There's a whole other expectation there around even more monitoring. So it's very
Yeah.
tricky. But what I would suggest as a starting point maybe is for for teams to sit down and do a bit of a, can just take 15 minutes over a cuppa, thinking about what are the real pain points in terms of our workload. So and which of those things are not really worth it. So something to take a long time, but actually there's no way around it and they feel really valuable. But it's what are those kind of time wasting things that we think that
Yeah.
we change. And yeah, you can't get rid of it all, but we are finding with schools are finding
There
ways.
always are. And I think also having that conversation, sometimes as a leader, I remember when I was a head teacher, there were some things that I couldn't change. But the fact, if you have the conversation and say, I hear what you're saying, but actually, given where I am right now, because of the pressures I've got or the restrictions I've got, I can't make that change. The fact that you've had the conversation, you get a reason, makes you feel better about the fact you've had a conversation.
Yeah, I
I mean,
completely agree because you just want to feel. I think just being acknowledged is a big part of it as well, and also understanding what those tensions are, because I think sometimes I've heard teachers mention that a change has been made and it's had a knock-on effect on their workload, but they don't really understand why. So I think that
yeah.
understanding why is really important for leadership as well.
And I think I see a lot of my social media. Somebody will post like, "Oh, we've been given our birthday off as an extra day off," or every week in the staff room there's a mystery mug and you find it in your cupboard and it's got chocolates in it and all that kind of stuff. And all of those things are really lovely and they're kind of recognitions of that somebody's thinking about you. So I think those nice acts of generosity or kindness from leadership to a team show that you are thinking about your team. But also what they don't do is solve some of the things that we've been talking about, where you might say, well, I love the fact that you left me a mug of hot chocolate, wherever it may be, but actually I'm still here at 7 o'clock and I'm still getting emails that are pinging at 11 o'clock at night. And so there are two distinct elements. I think one is around culture and pedagogy and the other is around the kind of social aspect of valuing people socially, but then also valuing them professionally in terms of what your structures are.
Yeah, absolutely. And our research seems to be suggesting that teachers want both. So
Yeah,
they do
fair
really
enough.
value the
Yeah,
gestures, and they value they talk a lot about food. They talk a lot about we love it when, when we have cakes and when we get people bring us nice biscuits at parents' evening.
yeah,
Those little things do make a difference, because it's feeling cared about is
yeah,
massive, isn't it? And like you say, it's always important to recognise that they on their own they're not enough, because it's the
yeah,
structural things that really impact on working hours and conditions. But yeah, those gestures are definitely worth making as a leader. And one of the tweaks that people have started to, some of our schools have decided to make during this research, or at least considering, is to sort of bring the two together. So things like having one staff meeting every few weeks that has no agenda other than to just talk to each other and say how's it going, and that's it, with food.
yeah,
So, like,
obviously.
kind of, and actually in that, the kind of idea is that in those conversations it will be good for that, what we call in the research like relational resilience, because it's building those relationships, which is really important, particularly for people who are new to a school. It can be quite hard to get into established kind of cliques, can't it?
Yeah,
But there'll also be a lot of sharing just naturally around pedagogy, professional behaviours, etc., and just that bit of and feeling cared for and all the rest of it. So, though, and again, I know even that's not an easy solution, because people have got so many things they need to cram into their staff room, staff meetings, and you're going to get people saying, "Well, I don't want to have a well-being staff meeting. I want to get on with my marking." I totally get that,
yeah,
but it's about just trying to balance all these different things in a way that feels helpful, because I think the power of talk is, it's worth spending that time on, every few weeks.
yeah. And you need to be a senior leadership that's got I don't mean a policy as in a file on the shelf. I mean a culture policy around well-being is important, and this is how we show it, and this is how we review it on a regular basis, because that gives people that permission to kind of have those discussions. Again, I remember working with a setting where the senior leadership team had brought in somebody to do some breath work at the staff meeting. So they were having hours. And again, it was, the person concerned was great, and all the kind of reasoning behind why breath work is important was great. But the overriding feeling was, what a waste of flaming time when I could have been either doing my display, doing my marking. And that's because it appeared as like a blip within let's do a bit of well-being, let's get somebody in to do some breath work or some yoga or some meditation. And if it just appears out of nowhere and isn't on the back of a culture, then I think people really resent it. Whereas if somebody's saying, look, I think this is really important for us where we are in our development, let's do this as a staff together and forget the rest of the stuff, you probably have more faith that you were going to be given some catch-up time, or that if it didn't happen, it wouldn't matter. I think it's that idea that if I'm spending this time on me, or if I'm spending this time on breath work and I don't get that done, is somebody going to jump on me like a ton of bricks and say, why isn't that done? And the answer is, well, because I spent time doing that or not doing that. So as we've said all the way through these episodes, it's really complex and it's big. But I think it starts with leadership. It starts with the people who are at the forefront of your space. And then the people who are leading the different sections of your space, they've got to have that cohesive view about how important mental health and resilience is, but put it into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you said about it starting with leadership, because in the big survey that we did in April, so we had kind of just short of 3,000 teachers completed it. And what we found was, when you look at all the different things that we measured, like supportive leadership, workload, self-esteem, lots of kind of individual factors as well as school level factors, they kind of interact with each other to have an impact on outcomes like well-being, stress, burnout. And interestingly, what we found is that support from leadership has a knock-on effect. It acts through lots of other factors, so you get this sort of like cascade effect. So when you look at the numbers, you find that actually workload, we know workload is going to affect well-being, but actually support from management acts through the workload to affect the well-being. It did matter who the leaders were. Not all teachers had the same workload or perceived workload, which again I thought was interesting, because part of me thought, what's the point of this survey? Because actually everyone's going to say, I'm really stressed, my workload's really high, and it varied. Do you know what I mean? It did vary quite a lot, and the variation was partly due to leadership practices. But that comes with a caveat, because the last thing I want it to come across as is that I'm saying it's all up to leaders, because it's absolutely not. And we're going to talk in another episode about the factors beyond leadership, because we know that head teachers have got their hands tied behind their back in certain ways, and all the rest of it. It's not about shifting the blame. It's not about blame anywhere. I don't want anyone to feel any blame, because the teacher wellbeing problem is massive and it's complex, as we were saying. So it's not about putting it in anyone's this is your problem, this is your problem. It's about saying, this is an issue that operates as a process across a whole system. And in terms of trying to find ways to make teachers feel better and more well, it's about trying to find levers for change across the system, not just in one place. But we do know that school leaders obviously are really quite central in terms of like a locus of control in a school. And so, they can do lots of, in a positive way. It's like they can make a difference through little things that have a knock-on effect on everything else.
And I think personality massively comes into it, and you meet people in your life who you know, and I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of heads now and leaders, and some of them are just really well tuned in and emotionally intelligent and come from a place of valuing. And other people, they're not horrible people, and it's not that they value you any less, but they're not tuned in to that level of emotional intelligence. So it would never occur to them in a month of Sundays that that's what somebody else might need, because it's not what they need particularly. So I think what you've got in schools is this, in earlier settings, is this wonderful amalgamation of personalities. But when one of those rides to leadership, you tend to get a space that's led predominantly by the personality of the primary leader. And if that is somebody who's really tuned in to emotional intelligence and really values because of their own experience, you get a very different culture and expectation. And I get what you're saying, and we are going to talk about it in the next episode. But government policy doesn't really take into account teacher well-being when everything that we're wanting early years practitioners in schools to achieve is outcome driven and not always based around child development. And certainly Ofsted, although they say they're doing more of it, certainly don't take into account the effect that, of well-being of things like inspections. I mean, we did a little poll on my ABC Does social media platforms and said if you had to ask Ofsted one question, what would you ask them? We got a massive response and none of them were positive. Nobody was saying, thank you for all the work you do. There was lots of anger. There was lots of, people saying this happened to me and it was awful, or why you put me under this stress. So if you've got a culture where the work that you do is being assessed by an organization who is perceived to be like that, then I get what you're saying. We can't just say, hey, leaders, your shout, you've got to do it. We also need to change that policy further up to make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we really need to protect the well-being of head teachers as well and take that very seriously. So the project that we're doing is focusing on teacher well-being, which sort of includes teachers of all different levels of responsibility and leadership. But there is a project also being funded by the ESRC, the same funding council, looking at sustainable school leadership, and they're looking specifically at the pressures that head teachers are under, and that's really, really important to bear in mind. So there's a tension, between not wanting to make something easier for one part of the teaching population and harder for the other, and we're very trying to be very mindful of that, and also that head teachers need to remember that they cannot solve everything, and middle leaders and every kind of leader, they can't feel responsible for everybody's well-being. It's not as simple as that.
No, and I think that's why you build hopefully a culture within your team. And even we've talked about in this podcast before about the fact that the government are given more free childcare places, which appears great for parents, but we know that the preschool settings are struggling in terms of finding enough people to cover the space, in terms of being able to afford to stay open. So you've got this kind of massive crisis that's going on with all of this lovely shiny government offer, and that in itself, if you can't afford to fund the places that you've got, if you haven't got the right amount of staff, if the staff aren't right, if you think you're going to have to close your nursery, all of that is pressing down on you, and they are massive. So then to also engender a culture on a daily basis where you're valuing everybody else's well-being and resilience, not impossible, but difficult.
Very difficult. And one of the things you mentioned just a minute ago about emotional intelligence, that has come out as incredibly important in trying to do that. So one way that leaders can make a massive difference without having to actually make lots of changes as such, or structural changes, is just by how they are with people. So that's come up an awful lot in our discussions with teachers. They say that they really, really value it when the leadership team around them kind of authentically listens, but they're also just more holistically responsive, and that what was the word that you used? Tuned in. That really resonates with what people have been saying to us. They just want to feel kind of noticed, acknowledged, cared about, and not just in a tokenistic, oh, how are you feeling? And then nothing changes.
Filling the questionnaire way,
But that sort of like responsive kind of where they talk about where a head or somebody else in leadership kind of notices that actually everybody's having a bit of a dip, it's a real pinch point, for example, or, there's a particular issue with morale or something that's happened, and they respond to it in some way. And it doesn't mean they can solve it all, but they might say, oh, well, actually, do you know what? We're going to cancel this. We're not going to have that extra parents' evening, or we're not going to have this extra. We're going to move this, aspect of our sort of school improvement plan, this priority or whatever. We're going to move that into next term. And the other thing, as well as that being responsive in your behaviour, there's also general principles of just thinking about people as people and about their emotions, which I think we're really good at doing. Teachers are generally really good at doing for pupils, aren't they? We're
Yeah.
always thinking about how can we boost our pupils' self-esteem, but actually teachers' self-esteem can be quite at risk. So there's an interesting book. It's really old now, but it's still find it really useful about teacher self-esteem. Can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it talks about all the different threats, and it really makes you realise that actually in any one day you could have a lot of threats to your self-esteem. It could be a parent shouting at you. It
Yeah.
could be
Your lesson goes wrong.
your lesson goes
You
wrong.
manage behaviour
Oh
badly.
Lord, the head, you have motivation and you don't
Yeah,
get
it
as
didn't
much
go
sort
well.
of
Yeah.
good feedback as you think. And actually, it's we can do something about that now because we can't get rid of all the threats, but what we can do is do the boosters. So the threats will still be there, but you can create boosters to people's self-esteem at any point in any day. You can create them yourself by saying things like, I had a really tricky PGC placement myself when I was training, and it was really tough. And on the way home every day, I would think like, right, think of 3 things that have gone well, because otherwise I was just focusing on the all.
Yeah.
And I know it's like a really kind of, the focus on the child throwing things at me across the classroom. It's kind of cheesy, but it does make a difference. It feels a bit artificial, but actually those things work, or they work for me anyway. And I think giving to each other, we don't, because we're often in our own classroom on our own, or there might be other people there, but they're so busy doing what they're doing. Nobody's telling you that you're doing a good job that often. And I think
Yeah.
that's something we can work on as in our settings. Just saying like, oh, that was, if you're for example, if you're sort of over there and you see somebody teaching their phonics group over there, saying kind of like, oh, that the children look like they really enjoyed
Yeah,
that.
they love that. Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like, oh, that was so sweet how you did whatever. It doesn't have to be linked to performance management targets. Just like, oh,
Yeah.
right, lovely. All right, because teachers are amazing, and every second of the day they are managing all these complex things in the classroom, and everyone's feelings, and everybody's learning, and they're not really getting any feedback, explicit feedback.
Yeah.
So I think leaders, but not just leaders, colleagues in general, need to try and give as much praise as possible, obviously in an authentic way, because that's something that's come up quite a lot, that teachers just feel, yeah,
Undervalued.
they're just
Yeah.
hammering and hammering and
Yeah.
hammering, and it's kind of into a bit of an abyss. And the only thing you get really is not the only thing you get, but it can feel a bit like what you're always getting is, oh, you need to do more of this, and we need to get this percentage
Up a bit, and
to
yeah, we need to
here,
get better at that.
rather than, and actually they've achieved tons of things
Yeah.
every day, but they're not recognised.
So I think what we're kind of saying is, although teachers and early years practitioners are indeed superheroes, they're not superhuman, and that element of humanity is what we all need to focus on, both with ourselves and with everybody else.
Yeah.
So on that note, we are going to end this episode now. When we come back with Steph, it'll be our 4th and final episode, and we're going to talk a bit more about the work that she's doing in terms of research, but also what we alluded to in terms of how policy might need to change to really support a growth in teacher resilience and wellbeing. But for now, thanks, Steph.
Thanks.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Steph, for joining us and providing us with such valuable information and insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Steph Ainsworth. Now, if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes and be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content that will include ideas for your setting and links to loads of relevant resources.